The twin suns of Heliosphere cast a golden light over the rugged human colony. The air was dry, the ground cracked, and the sky stretched endlessly, a perfect place for a fresh start, or a hiding spot. On this desolate planet, Captain Elias Voss, a human engineer, lived a simple life, far from the battles and chaos of his past. His days consisted of fixing ships, working on small mechanical projects, and enjoying the peace that came with life on the edge of the galaxy. But that peace was about to be shattered. Elias was working on a small freighter, the grease on his hands thick from hours of labor, when he heard the hum of a shuttle approaching. He turned, wiping his hands on a rag, and watched as a sleek alien ship descended from the sky. The craft was not like anything Elias had seen before. Its silver surface gleamed under the sunlight, its design elegant yet menacing. Something told him that this wasn't just a regular visitor. The shuttle landed in a small clearing nearby, the dust rising in swirling clouds as its engines powered down. Elias felt a strange tension in the air as he walked toward the ship. He knew this was no ordinary arrival, and his instincts, honed from years of experience, told him that he should be ready for anything. The door of the shuttle opened with a hiss, and two figures stepped out. The first was a woman, a tall, regal alien with shimmering blue skin and silver eyes. She was dressed in fine clothes, rich in color and design, and carried an air of authority that immediately marked her as someone of importance. Behind her, a small child, no older than 10, clung to her side. Her skin was similar to the woman's, but her features were softer, more innocent. Elias was not easily intimidated, but something about the pair made him pause. The woman's gaze swept over him, and despite her calm demeanor, he sensed a deep urgency in her eyes. She spoke first, her voice carrying a musical quality, yet there was a weight to her words. "I am Princess Lorana of the Drakari Empire," she said, her voice steady but strained. "I seek refuge. Please, help us." Elias's mind raced. The Drakari Empire was a powerful and dangerous force in the galaxy, known for its ruthless expansion and unyielding control. A princess of such a family, an enemy of the human colonies, would be an unusual and dangerous guest. Yet there was something about the desperation in her voice that made him pause. This wasn't the confident, demanding tone of royalty. It was the voice of someone who had lost everything. He stood still for a moment, weighing his options. His first instinct was to turn her away. The humans on this planet had no business with the Drakari, and the last thing he wanted was to become entangled in intergalactic politics. But the princess's eyes, wide with fear for her daughter, made it impossible for him to walk away. "What do you want from me?" Elias asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lorana's gaze dropped to the ground for a moment before she lifted it again, meeting his eyes with a mix of vulnerability and strength. "I am not asking for much. I ask only for protection, for a place to hide, until it is safe for us to leave." She hesitated. I offer myself to you, as your concubine, if you wish." The words hit Elias like a blow. He blinked in surprise, not sure if he had heard her correctly. A concubine. Was she truly offering herself to him? He wasn't sure what to make of it. It was a strange proposal, one that made little sense. Was she trying to buy his protection with a promise of her body? He didn't know the customs of her people, but this didn't sit right with him. "I don't want that," Elias replied firmly, his voice steady, but edged with confusion. "I'm not interested in whatever it is you're offering. You and your daughter can stay here, but not because of anything like that." Lorana's expression faltered for a moment, as though she hadn't expected rejection. But then, as though she realized there was no other choice, her shoulders slumped slightly. She nodded, her voice quieter but still clear. "Then I will ask only for refuge. I beg you to help us. The Drakari are hunting us. They will stop at nothing to destroy me." Elias looked at her for a long moment, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision before him. Helping a fugitive princess from a galactic empire could lead to danger, not just for him, but for everyone in the colony. But the sight of the child, clutching her mother's side, and the fear in Lorana's eyes, made it impossible for him to turn them away. "All right," Elias said at last, his voice steady. "You and your daughter can stay, but you'll have to lay low. I'll make sure you're safe. For now." Lorana nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She had placed her trust in a human, a creature from a race she had once thought beneath her. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. As they turned to walk toward his home, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would change everything. The next few days on Helios 4 were strange for Elias. Life had been quiet and uneventful on this remote planet until the arrival of Princess Lorana and her daughter, Yara. Now, everything seemed different. The simple, peaceful routine he had known for years was replaced by a sense of urgency and tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Elias had built his life around independence and solitude. The human colony on Helios 4 was small and mostly self-sufficient, tucked away far from the larger, more dangerous parts of the galaxy. But now, that sense of isolation seemed like a false security. He could feel the weight of the decision he had made, taking Lorana and Yara in. It wasn't just about offering them shelter. It was about protecting them from forces much bigger than he was. Lorana, once a princess with the power to command armies and fleets, now lived as a fugitive. She spent most of her time in Elias's small home, hiding from the world she once ruled. Her life of luxury and status had vanished, replaced by fear and uncertainty. She was no longer a symbol of power. She was a mother, doing everything she could to protect her daughter. Yara, the young girl, was quiet but curious. She seemed to sense the danger that lingered in the air, but like any child, she tried to find comfort in the new, unfamiliar place. Elias watched as she played in the dusty corners of his home, trying to make sense of a world so different from the one she had known. She clung to her mother often, but there was something in her eyes, a spark of hope, perhaps, that made Elias believe she could adapt. But for Lorana, it was harder. Her mind was always racing, always searching for a way to escape the relentless pursuit of the Drakari. She had once been a part of an empire that spanned across the stars, but now she was nothing more than a target. Her people, her family, had turned their backs on her. She had no allies, no home. She could only rely on the kindness of a human, a race she had once viewed as insignificant. Elias tried to keep life as normal as possible, though he knew it wasn't. He worked on his projects, fixing old machines and ships, just as he always did. But every day, the fear gnawed at him. What if the Drakari found them? What if they came to this remote colony and destroyed everything just to get to the princess? One evening, as the twin suns began to set, painting the sky with shades of red and orange, Elias sat outside, leaning against the wall of his small cabin. The stars were already beginning to shine, distant and cold. Lorana joined him, standing beside him in silence. "I didn't expect this," Lorana said quietly, her voice a mixture of wonder and regret. "I never thought I would be here, on a human world, hiding like this. But I have nowhere else to go." Elias glanced at her, trying to understand her pain. "You didn't ask for this," he said. "None of this is your fault." Lorana gave him a small, sad smile. "Maybe not, but I brought this danger to you, to your world." Her eyes darkened as she looked into the distance. "The Drakari will not stop. They never stop." Elias didn't know much about the Drakari, but he knew enough. They were a fierce and powerful race, known for their cruelty and their ambition to conquer and control. If they wanted Lorana dead or alive, they would come for her, no matter what. Elias knew he had no power to stop them, but that didn't mean he was willing to give up. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe," Elias said, his voice firm. "I'm not going to let them take you." Lorana turned to him, her eyes softening. "Why? Why would you do this for me? I'm nothing now, just a fugitive." Elias looked at her, unsure how to answer. Because Because you're not nothing. You're a person, and you deserve to be safe. And because you're not alone. You have a daughter, and she deserves a future. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lorana looked down at the ground, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the galaxy had settled on her. I don't know how to survive like this. I was a princess, Elias. I had everything I could ever want. And now, I have nothing. Elias didn't respond immediately. He understood the feeling. He had once been part of something bigger, part of a world that felt like it would always be there. But now, he had only his small, quiet life. He had chosen this, and it had made him strong in a way that Lorana hadn't experienced. He had learned to survive on his own, to make do with what he had, and he would teach her the same. You don't need to be a princess to survive, Elias said quietly. You just need to be strong enough to fight for what matters. And I think you've got that strength in you. Lorana's eyes searched his face for a moment before she nodded slowly. She wasn't sure if she could believe him, but something about his words gave her hope. Maybe she could survive this new life. Maybe there was still a future for her and Yara, even if it wasn't the one she had imagined. As the stars twinkled above them, Elias felt the weight of what was coming. The Drakari wouldn't wait much longer. But for now, all he could do was promise to protect them, and hope that his skills as a human would be enough to face whatever danger lay ahead. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet life that Elias had known was slipping away. He found himself constantly looking over at his shoulder, listening for any sign of danger. The threat of the Drakari was a shadow that seemed to follow them no matter where they went, and Elias knew they could not hide forever. Princess Lorana and her daughter, Yara, had begun to settle into their new life, but it was clear that the change was difficult for both of them. Lorana, who had once walked in the halls of power and luxury, now spent her days doing simple chores around the small cabin. She had always been taught to rely on others, but now she was learning to rely on herself and on Elias. She found it hard to accept, but her fierce love for her daughter pushed her forward. Yara, on the other hand, was still trying to make sense of the new world around her. She missed the gardens of her home, the music and laughter of her people, and the safety of her royal palace. But she was a child, and like all children, she adapted quickly. She began to explore the surroundings of the cabin, finding small wonders in the wilds of Heliosphore. She had even made a few friends among the local creatures, small animals that scurried about, unbothered by the presence of aliens. Yet, despite their efforts to settle into this strange new life, both mother and daughter could not shake the feeling of danger that lingered just beyond the horizon. They were safe, for now, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the Drakari found them. Elias did his best to keep them safe, working during the day and reinforcing the defenses around his home. He had never expected to become a protector of royalty, but something about Lorana and Yara made him feel like it was his duty. Every day, he made sure that there was enough food, water, and supplies to last. He also worked on hiding the shuttle that had brought them here, making it look like just another abandoned piece of scrap. But one afternoon, as Elias worked on the shuttle, something in the sky caught his eye. A flicker of movement, a shadow crossing the sun. His heart skipped a beat as he looked up, squinting into the distance. A ship. It wasn't the sleek, silver craft that had brought Lorana to his world. It was something larger. A warship with sharp angles and dark colors, unmistakable in its design. The Drakari had found them. Without thinking, Elias rushed toward the cabin. His mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to warn Lorana, and quickly. The Drakari were not known for their mercy, and if they had come to this planet, it meant they were ready for a fight. He burst into the cabin, his voice urgent. Lorana, get Yara and pack everything. We have to leave. Now. Lorana looked up from the corner where she had been reading to Yara, her face confused. What's wrong? She asked, her calm demeanor betraying the fear that Elias could sense beneath the surface. The Drakari ship, it's coming. They found us, Elias said, his voice tight with worry. We don't have much time. Lorana's face drained of color. No. She stood up quickly, grabbing Yara's hand. We can't fight them. We have to run. Elias nodded grimly. I'll get the shuttle ready. You two go ahead and meet me there. Hurry. Lorana didn't hesitate. She grabbed Yara's hand and pulled her toward the door. Elias watched them go, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. He had never planned for a battle like this, and he wasn't sure how he would protect them against an entire Drakari warship. But there was no time to think about that now. He had to act. He moved quickly, running to the back of his cabin to where the shuttle was hidden. It was a small ship, nothing compared to the Drakari warship, but it was all he had. He worked quickly, fixing the engines and getting the ship powered up. His hands shook with urgency, but he kept his focus. There was no room for mistakes. As the shuttle's engines hummed to life, Elias heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. The Drakari were landing. His stomach twisted in knots as he looked toward the sky. The shadow of the warship was growing larger, its massive form now visible against the bright blue sky. Elias looked back at the cabin, where Lorana and Yara were waiting. They were ready. The moment was now. Elias climbed into the cockpit of the shuttle, his heart racing. The ship's engines roared to life as he lifted off the ground, climbing into the sky. He could see the Drakari warship in the distance now, its weapon systems beginning to power up. Elias knew that they had no chance of outrunning it, but they had to try. The only hope was to get far enough away from the colony before the Drakari struck. The shuttle shot forward, the engines howling as it sliced through the atmosphere. Elias gripped the controls tightly, keeping his eyes on the path ahead. There was no turning back now. The Drakari were coming for them, and the only thing that mattered was escaping. As the shuttle raced toward the stars, Elias couldn't help but wonder if they would make it out alive. But he wouldn't give up. Not now. Not when Lorana and Yara needed him. The shuttle surged forward, its engines roaring as Elias pushed the controls forward. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Above him, the massive shadow of the Drakari warship loomed closer. The odds of escaping seemed slim, but there was no turning back now. Lorana and Yara were depending on him. Lorana sat beside Elias, her face pale with worry as she looked out of the window at the approaching Drakari ship. Yara was tucked beside her, clutching her mother's hand. The young girl's wide eyes were filled with fear, but she stayed quiet, knowing that there was nothing she could do but trust the man who had taken them in. "Are you sure we can outrun them?" Lorana asked, her voice tight with anxiety. She had lived through many battles, but this was different. This was not her fight, it was Elias's. And she had to trust him. Elias didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the controls, focusing on the shuttle's speed and direction. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice steady but strained. "But I'm not going to stop trying." They had no weapons, no defense against the Drakari's firepower. All they had was the shuttle's speed and the hope that they could get far enough ahead before the warship could lock onto them. The shuttle sped through the atmosphere of Heliosphere, climbing higher into the sky as they broke through the cloud cover. Elias could see the Drakari warship now, its massive form blotting out the stars behind it. The warship's guns were charging, ready to fire. Elias knew they had moments before the attack began. "Hold on," Elias shouted as he pulled the shuttle into a sharp turn. The ship responded instantly, but the sudden change in direction sent the three of them tumbling to the side. Yara gasped, but Lorana held her tightly, keeping her steady. The Drakari warship fired. A bright flash of light erupted from the ship's guns, and Elias's heart skipped a beat as a bolt of energy shot past them, missing by mere inches. The blast rattled the shuttle, and Elias struggled to keep control. The ship's warning system blared, warning him of a hit, but it was too late to avoid it. He could only keep the shuttle steady and pray they would survive. "Elias," Lorana cried out, "what do we do now?" "We keep flying," he said, his voice unwavering. We don't stop. Elias gritted his teeth and pushed the shuttle to its limits. He could feel the heat of the Drakari warship's pursuit on his back, but he couldn't afford to look behind. They needed to get away, and fast. The Drakari fired again, this time with more precision. Another blast hit the shuttle's rear shield, causing it to flicker and fade. The ship jolted forward, throwing everyone off balance. Elias quickly corrected the course, but they were getting too close to the warship now. They wouldn't make it if they didn't act fast. "We need to make the jump," Elias said, his mind already calculating the risks. "There's a nearby asteroid field. If we can get into it, we might lose them in the rocks. But we'll have to make the jump blind. No time for calculations." Lorana's eyes widened with fear. "That's too dangerous." "It's our only chance," Elias said, his voice calm despite the tension. "We don't have much time." Elias pushed the shuttle's engines even harder, speeding toward the asteroid field that loomed ahead. He could see the debris and rocks floating in space, creating a maze of obstacles. The Drakari would have a hard time following them through the field, but Elias wasn't sure how much the shuttle could handle. It wasn't built for such a maneuver. As they entered the asteroid field, Elias guided the shuttle through the tight gaps between the large rocks. The shuttle's engines hummed as it dodged and weaved, narrowly avoiding collisions. The Drakari warship followed, its massive size making it harder to navigate through the field, but Elias knew that it would still be able to fire at them. They needed to get farther away. Then, without warning, the shuttle's warning system blared again. A massive asteroid was heading straight for them. Elias had no choice. He slammed the shuttle's engines into full reverse, trying to push them out of the way. The ship jolted again, but this time, they managed to avoid the collision. The asteroid passed within inches, leaving only a trail of debris in its wake. The Drakari weren't so lucky. The warship, unable to avoid the asteroid in time, collided with the massive rock. The impact sent a shockwave through space, and the warship's shields flickered before it finally failing. Elias could see the explosion from the corner of his eye, a bright flash of light that momentarily blinded him. "Did we do it?" Lorana asked, her voice breathless. Elias didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the controls, watching for any signs of pursuit. The Drakari ship was no longer behind them, but Elias didn't believe they were safe just yet. The asteroid field was still full of dangers, and they were running low on fuel. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We've lost them. For now." Lorana's shoulders sagged with relief, and Yara let out a small sigh of relief, her grip loosening on her mother's hand. They had survived. But Elias knew it wasn't over. The Drakari would never stop hunting them. And this escape was only the beginning of the journey. The silence in the shuttle was deafening after the explosion. Elias gripped the controls tightly, still processing what had just happened. The Drakari warship had been forced into a collision with an asteroid, but that didn't mean they were safe. The asteroid field was full of hazards, and their fuel was running low. It was only a matter of time before the Drakari would regroup and resume their pursuit. Lorana sat in the passenger seat beside him, her eyes wide with concern. Yara, her daughter, had fallen asleep in her lap, exhausted from the chaos. Elias could see the weight of her worry, but her face was calm. She was trying to stay strong for Yara. Elias glanced at her. "How's she doing?" Lorana's gaze softened as she looked down at her daughter. "She's been through too much already. I just want her to feel safe, even if it's just for a moment." Elias nodded, his fingers twitching as he tried to think of their next move. The shuttle was drifting, barely making it through the field. "We're running low on fuel," he said, his voice steady. "We need to find a way to refuel, or we'll be stuck out here." Lorana's eyes sharpened. "Is there a place we can go?" Elias thought for a moment. There were few places out in this part of space that could provide shelter, but one idea came to mind. A long-forgotten space station in an isolated corner of the galaxy, known for being a neutral zone. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them the fuel they needed to make it out of this field. And maybe, just maybe, they could find some allies. "I think I know a place," Elias said, pulling up the coordinates on the console. "It's a station in the Xeric Nebula. It's old, and it's not exactly friendly territory, but it's a place to refuel and get our bearings." Lorana hesitated. "Xeric Nebula. That's a dangerous place. No one goes there unless they have to." "I know," Elias replied, setting the course. "But it's our best option." The shuttle hummed as it slowly turned, heading toward the nebula. As they moved further into the field, the stars around them became faint, the nebula clouding everything with its thick, colorful gases. Elias could feel the tension rising in the small cabin as they approached the unknown. It wasn't long before they reached the edge of the Xeric Nebula. The nebula was massive, a swirling storm of gas and dust. The station was somewhere within, hidden in the chaos. Elias squinted at the controls, trying to pick out any signs of life. "There it is," he said, his voice low as he spotted the faint outline of the old station on the display. It was a large, cylindrical structure, covered in patches of rust and age. Its lights flickered intermittently, but it was still functional. Barely. As they approached, Elias noticed a few ships parked outside the station. They weren't the usual types he'd expect. No merchant freighters or travelers. These were military-class ships, small, sleek, and armed. The kinds of ships that could make anyone nervous. Elias slowed the shuttle as they neared the docking bay, aware of the silent scrutiny from the ships nearby. He set the shuttle down, its engines coughing as it landed with a slight jolt. The airlock sealed, and the ship's systems went into standby mode. They had arrived. "We'll need to stay low," Elias muttered as he stood up. "This place is full of people who don't like outsiders. Keep your heads down." Lorana nodded, holding Yara close. They both knew that they had no choice but to move forward. The Drakari were still out there, hunting them, and their only chance at survival was to find allies, no matter how strange or dangerous they might be. Elias led them out of the shuttle and into the dimly lit hallway of the station. The walls were lined with old, cracked panels, and the faint hum of the station's power systems was the only sound. The place felt abandoned, but Elias knew better. It was a hub for mercenaries, outcasts, and anyone who needed to disappear for a while. They made their way through the station, carefully avoiding any unwanted attention. The station was a maze of dark corners and narrow hallways, each turn more unsettling than the last. But they couldn't afford to be afraid. Not now. Finally, they reached the central hub. It was a large open space with a few scattered tables and chairs. A small bar was set up in one corner, and a handful of figures sat around, drinking and talking in low voices. Elias spotted a man sitting by the bar, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. He was human, like Elias, but he had the hardened look of someone who had seen too much. Elias approached him cautiously, and the man looked up, sizing him up with a single glance. "You looking for something?" the man asked, his voice rough. "We need fuel," Elias said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "And maybe some information. We're being hunted." The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't look like someone who needs help," he muttered, taking a long sip from his drink. "We're not asking for charity," Elias replied, his tone firm. "Just help, in exchange for something useful." The man studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I might know someone who can help you, but it's going to cost you." Elias's gaze hardened. "Name your price." The man grinned. "I'll take you to my contact, but be prepared for anything." Elias didn't hesitate. They had no other choice. Elias stood in the shadow of the bar, the conversation with the stranger still echoing in his mind. His hand rested on the hilt of his blaster, his eyes scanning the dimly lit station. They were deep in the Xeric Nebula now, and every step taken seemed more dangerous than the last. He needed to stay sharp. Lorana, still holding her daughter Yara close, stood beside him. The child had awoken and was silently clutching her mother's sleeve, sensing the tension in the air. The man, who had given his name as Rax, had led them to a small room at the back of the station. It was a temporary hideout, nothing special, but it had a lock on the door. And that was good enough for now. "Who's this contact of yours?" Elias asked, eyeing Rax as he sat on a dusty crate and fiddled with a small device. The man's attitude was relaxed, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that didn't go unnoticed. Rax looked up at Elias. "He's the kind of guy who knows people. Traders, smugglers, even a few mercenaries who owe him favors. If you want fuel, he can get it. But he won't do it for free, and trust me, you don't want to mess with him." Elias crossed his arms. "I don't care about his reputation. I care about getting fuel for the shuttle." Lorana added softly, her voice tinged with worry. "And I care about getting my daughter safe." Rax nodded slowly. "I get it, but nothing in this part of space is free. You'll have to make a deal. And I suggest you don't try to back out. People like him don't forget." The air felt thick as Elias processed the words. A deal. It was always the same, but right now it seemed like the only option. He glanced at Lorana, who gave him a reassuring nod. "We'll take our chances," Elias said, his voice steady, despite the storm of thoughts racing through his head. A moment later, Rax stood and led them through a narrow, winding corridor, moving deeper into the heart of the station. The silence around them felt heavy, as though every shadow held a hidden danger. The group was so used to being on the move, never staying too long in one place, always looking over their shoulders for the next threat. But this time, they didn't have the luxury of running. Finally, they reached the end of the hallway. There was a large door, reinforced with steel, with blinking red lights indicating the room beyond. Rax knocked twice, the sound echoing through the narrow corridor. A voice from the other side responded in a low, guttural tone. "What do you want?" The voice sounded rough and cold. Rax gave Elias a look, as if warning him to keep calm. "Got some business. Fuel and supplies. The usual." There was a pause, followed by the sound of the door unlocking. It slid open with a heavy groan. On the other side stood a man taller than Elias, dressed in dark armor, his face hidden by a helmet. His posture was rigid, and his gaze was cold, as if he were sizing up every person who stepped through the door. "Rax," the armored figure said, his voice muffled by the helmet. "I see you brought company." Rax stepped forward, standing just out of reach of the man. "They need something you can provide, but they don't come empty-handed." Elias raised an eyebrow, taking a small step forward. "What's your price?" The armored figure stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The room beyond was dimly lit, with a few old, flickering screens on the walls. A large table sat in the center, and behind it, a giant metal crate filled with supplies. There were no windows, no way to see what was outside, just the cold, mechanical silence of the station. The man finally spoke again, his tone neutral but heavy with the unspoken warning of someone who wasn't afraid to get their hands dirty. "You want fuel," he said, his eyes narrowing behind the helmet. "That's easy. I can give you all the fuel you need. But I'll need something in return. Something valuable." Elias stepped closer, his eyes focused on the man. "What kind of valuable?" The figure leaned forward, placing a hand on the table. "I'm not interested in credits or anything your government might offer. I want something more personal." Elias clenched his jaw. He didn't like the sound of that. Not one bit. "Explain." The armored figure gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "I want the knowledge. The kind that you've got from Earth. The things humans have done, survived, and learned. I want that knowledge. It could make me a fortune." Elias hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He glanced at Lorana, who seemed just as tense as he felt. "And if we don't agree?" The figure's tone remained calm but cold. "Then you leave, and I won't give you anything." Elias took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. The Drakari were still hunting them. If they didn't take this chance, they would be out of options. The thought of giving away Earth's secrets felt dangerous, but he had no choice. He looked at Lorana, then at Yara, who clung to her mother, still unaware of the true stakes. With a heavy heart, Elias made up his mind. "Fine," he said, his voice firm. "You have a deal." The armored figure's voice became colder, more final. "Good. I'll get your fuel." As the deal was made, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of their troubles. But with the Drakari still hot on their heels, they had no choice but to move forward. The moment the door closed behind them, Elias felt the weight of the deal they had just made. The room felt colder, the silence even more oppressive. Rax had promised that the fuel would be ready for them, but there was still the looming question of whether it would be enough to get them to safety, or if it was a trap. Lorana stood by the door, her hand resting on the handle, still unsure if they had made the right choice. She watched her daughter, Yara, who had fallen asleep in her arms, oblivious to the danger they were facing. Lorana's heart ached. She had promised herself that she would protect her daughter no matter what, but now she wasn't so sure. They had crossed too many lines, made too many deals with the wrong people. Elias stepped toward the window, peering out at the dark expanse of space beyond. The stars were distant, cold, a reminder of how far they had come. It had been a long journey since they had left the last safe world. They had fought off pirates, outrun bounty hunters, and barely managed to escape the Drakari. But now, it felt like they were running out of options. "Do you think he's really going to give us the fuel?" Lorana asked, her voice quiet. Elias didn't turn to face her. "I don't know, but we don't have a choice. If we don't get off this station, we're dead." The harsh reality of their situation hung in the air between them. The Drakari were relentless, and every day spent on the station brought them closer to being caught. If they could make it to the outer rim, they might be able to lose their pursuers. But it was a big if. And that if rested on the trust they had just placed in a man they barely knew. Lorana looked down at Yara, brushing a lock of hair from the child's face. "I just want her to be safe." Elias turned to face her then, his expression softening. "I know. I want that too. But sometimes we have to take risks. We can't keep running forever." Before Lorana could respond, the door to their room opened once more, and Rax stepped inside. His eyes flicked from Elias to Lorana before landing on Yara, still asleep in her mother's arms. "You're still here," Rax said, his voice a little more guarded than before. "Thought you'd be gone by now." "We're not in a rush," Elias replied, his tone even. "Are you ready to deliver?" Rax gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and without another word, he stepped aside, revealing the supplies they had been promised. It wasn't much, just enough fuel to get them to the next planet. But for now, it was all they could hope for. Lorana hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, her eyes scanning the containers. She had no way of knowing if the fuel was good, if it would last, if it was enough to keep them moving. But she had no choice but to trust Rax for now. Elias reached for the fuel canisters, his hand steady. "Is there a way we can make sure it's the real deal?" Rax chuckled softly, but there was no humor in his voice. "If you want to test it, you're welcome to. But you won't get far with that attitude. I'm not giving you a bad deal." Elias didn't like the feeling that lingered in his chest, but he kept his mouth shut. They didn't have the luxury of time to argue. He looked back at Lorana and nodded, signaling that it was time to go. As Elias filled their shuttle's fuel tank, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. There was too much uncertainty in their world now, too many unknowns. The Drakari were still out there, hunting them. Rax, as helpful as he seemed, was still a stranger, an ally they couldn't fully trust. "Are we really doing the right thing?" Lorana asked quietly as she climbed into the cockpit, her voice thick with doubt. Elias didn't answer right away. He stood at the entrance of the shuttle, staring out into the vastness of space, the weight of their decisions bearing down on him. "We don't have a choice," he said finally. "But we'll make it through. We have to." The sound of the engines powering up filled the silence between them. Elias took one last look at the station behind them before closing the shuttle's hatch. The stars outside were a blur as the ship slowly drifted away, pulling them into the unknown. As the shuttle ascended into the void, Elias felt the first small spark of hope ignite within him. Maybe they could make it. Maybe they could outrun the Drakari. Maybe they could survive the dangerous corners of space. It wasn't a guarantee, but for the first time in a long while, he believed it was possible. But one thing was clear: their journey was far from over. And no matter where it took them, Elias, Lorana, and Yara would face it together.